Once upon a time, long before thermostats beeped and electric blankets hummed, humans waged a forever battle against the chill of winter nights using little more than wits, wool, and the occasional roasted turnip. You see, staying warm wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was survival with a social flair. Before electricity lit up our lives like a caffeinated firefly, heating was a full-time job hidden in plain sight. And it started the moment you woke up, usually beneath a heap of scratchy wool blankets that smelled faintly of sheep and last year's rain. Let's begin in a place most known for its severe winters and even more severe porridge habits, medieval Europe. Medieval mornings, cold, clammy, and somewhat smoky. The day often began with the fire being coaxed back to life from the night's final embers. If you were lucky, and I mean nobility-level lucky, that fire wasn't even yours to build. A servant may have crept in early, shivering like a very polite ghost, to tend the hearth before you emerged from your wooden box of sleep. Now, before you imagine roaring fireplaces in every room, let's dispel that coziness right away. Most households, noble or otherwise, had just one fireplace, centrally located and only marginally accusatory. The family would gather round it like moths to a candle, only colder and slightly more grumpy. In peasant homes, the hearth might sit right in the middle of the single room, smoke trailing lazily up to a hole in the thatch roof, if the architect had thought of ventilation. If not, you simply coughed like someone possessed and hoped the heat would make up for the mild asphyxiation. And the beds, built for warmth as much as rest. People slept together not just due to limited space, but also because sharing body heat was more effective than any blanket. That's also how the phrase three-dog night came about. In particularly frigid locales, people would sleep with as many dogs as needed to stay warm. A three-dog night meant you were really in it. A four-dog night? Generally reserved for the kind of cold that threatened composure and toes. Blankets, as you might guess, were not the plush microfiber clouds we know today. They were more like aggressive upholstery, heavy woolen layers that doubled as capes, cloaks, and occasionally makeshift sleds for robust children. Sometimes the wealthy used furs, luxurious, yes, but also teeming with their own ecosystem of medieval freeloaders. If you needed warmth during the day, you dressed in layers. Imagine the onion aesthetic, only itchier. Wool tunics over linen shirts under heavier wool cloaks. The clothing was impressively layered, like a pastry nobody wanted to eat, and always a hat. Warmth escapes through the head, as every grandmother since the dawn of hats has reminded us. There were, of course, a few marvels of pre-electric engineering. Enter the bed warmer. A metal pan with a long handle, filled with hot coals, slid under your covers like a dangerous promise. If one was particularly sleepy or particularly unlucky, the bed warmer might set your bed ablaze, but at least you'd go warm. In other parts of the world, warmth took on far more elegant forms. In Japan, there was the kotatsu, a low wooden table covered by a heavy blanket with a heat source underneath. Families would sit with their legs tucked beneath, conversing, dining, even napping beneath the table's thermal embrace. It was like furniture and a cuddle in one. And let us not forget the humble hot brick. Bricks were commonly heated in the fire, wrapped in cloth, and tucked into beds at night or carried beneath cloaks during the day. A medieval microwavable heat pack, delivered at a glacial pace. All of these rituals, the layering, the communal fires, the creative warmth hacks, formed the rhythm of daily life. and behind every cleverly heated corner was someone, bleary-eyed, stoking flames in the dark, tipping ashes, and counting logs like a forest accountant. If you find your toes especially warm under your blanket tonight, remember, that comfort was once the labor of an entire household, a dance of fire and fabric across centuries, all to fend off the tilt of the Earth's axis. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, let the flames of history dim just slightly as we continue our quiet journey through the cozy, curious ways humanity braved a cold world. Without a single flick of a switch, it all starts with fire. Not the thrilling, Prometheus stole it kind of fire, but the patient, everyday sort, the kind our ancestors coaxed from damp sticks and sheer desperation. Before thermostats and electric blankets, human survival in winter depended on whether you could control a flame, or at least convince it to stay for dinner. In the earliest chapters of warmth-seeking history, our caveman cousins didn't have much more than shaggy hides, flickering flames, and the eternal optimism that maybe, just maybe, this winter would be mild. Spoiler, it rarely was. But necessity breeds creativity, especially when your toes are freezing. Early humans huddled inside caves, which, contrary to their drafty reputation, had a few advantages. No rent, decent acoustics, and surprisingly good insulation if you happen to be into stone. A fire pit at the center provided heat and light, and a reliable way to smoke out any cave bears who'd overstayed their welcome. The smoke, drifting up and staining the ceilings blacker than burnt mammoth roast, also helped waterproof the roof. Rustic charm, Neolithic addition. Eventually, people graduated from caves to actual houses, which were marginally less damp and could be placed somewhere with less bear traffic. Across ancient Mesopotamia, mud brick houses clustered around communal courtyards where fuel-efficient cooking fires doubled as cozy social hubs. That's right, before cafes or group texts, there was smoke in your hair and stories around the fire. If warmth was a communal event, so was gossip. And the clay walls of these ancient homes served as early insulators, making them surprisingly warmer than you'd expect from, well, dirt. Meanwhile, farther north in colder places, people upped the ante. The ancient Scandinavians didn't play around when it came to winter. They developed longhouses, basically wooden dwellings shared by families, livestock, and probably a chorus of deeply judgmental chickens. To modern sensibilities, it may sound undignified to cuddle up next to your goat for warmth, but when icy winds are howling outside, even a goat's armpit starts to look inviting. The central hearth of the home burned steadily, warming both humans and hooved friends alike. Yes, it smelled of smoke and sheep, but it was home. The ancient Romans, ever the overachievers, went a step beyond and said, "What if we just heat the floors?" Thus, the Hippocaust was born, a marvel of engineering that passed hot air beneath marble surfaces. Elite Romans could walk barefoot across warm mosaics while philosophizing about destiny and probably complaining about public bathhouse etiquette. The system was ingenious, but a bit high maintenance. It involved stoking fires in basement furnaces and occasionally hiring someone nimble enough to crawl around and make repairs without becoming toast. Of course, warm floors were fabulous, but your average Roman citizen lived in an insula, essentially a multi-story apartment building made of wood, hopes, and highly flammable dreams. With no hypercourse to help, people relied on charcoal braziers to fight off the chill. And now, we arrive at a classic historical balancing act. Do I want to be cold, or do I want to die of carbon monoxide poisoning? It's a timeless question, really. Not to be outdone, the Chinese were also developing their own sophisticated heating systems. As early as a few centuries BCE, families in northern China used kangs, raised brick beds heated by flues connected to kitchen stoves. In essence, your bed was made of fire-warmed masonry, and your dreams were gently roasted to perfection. It's like a hot stone massage, only you're asleep and not paying for it. These ancient methods all share a sense of intimacy, of gathering close, bundling together, sharing body heat and stories, and every now and then, a suspiciously burnt stew. Warmth was never just about survival. It was about connection and comfort, and maybe a pet pig underfoot. By the time the Middle Ages rolled in with their signature draftiness and occasional plagues, people were already masters of the double sock lifestyle, their next stage of warming wizardry. We're almost there. You can already feel the feathery whisper of woolen tunics and the smoky scent of hearths to come. In the velvety darkness of the pre-electric world, long before thermostats and radiant floor heating, the humble fireplace stood as the reigning monarch of domestic warmth. And just like any tenured monarch, it was both beloved and wildly inefficient. If you were lucky enough to be born into a home with a hearth, congratulations. You had a roughly pillow-sized patch of warmth near the fire, and the rest of your house was best described as a charmingly rustic freezer. Fireplaces in early Europe were not so much tools of temperature control as they were smoke funnels with identity issues. In medieval halls, the fire would crackle proudly in the center of the room, smoke spiraling upward toward a hole in the roof, if you had one. If not, your eyes, lungs, and hair would absorb a generous amount of medieval ambience. Families huddled around these blazes like moths to a flickering, slightly dangerous flame. It was less about heating the room and more about reheating your soul, one toe at a time. Eventually, someone had the revolutionary idea of putting the fireplace against a wall and adding a chimney. Brilliant, yes, but we must admire the many centuries it took to arrive at this conclusion. The Romans had underfloor heating with their clever hypocausts. Meanwhile, Northern Europe was debating how much smoke inhalation was actually too much. Now, once the fire was burning and the chimney doing its best to usher out smoke rather than dignity, households began the cozy ritual of evening bundling. Bedtime was when fashion hit peak utility. Enter the bed cap, essentially a beanie's older, more responsible cousin, worn to sleep to keep the brain from freezing and the hairstyle contained. For those lucky enough to afford it, woolen nightclothes, flannel wraps, and layered blankets turned beds into heavily fortified nap nests. The goal: trap every molecule of warmth like a miser guarding gold. And speaking of warmth, hoarding. Let us not wander too far without discussing the warming pan. A shallow metal pan filled with hot coals, swished under the bed covers to take the edge off the frigid sheets. It was a true marvel of resourcefulness and just a bit of reckless optimism. Because nothing says sweet dreams like dragging red-hot embers across flammable linens. Many a mattress met its crispy end in the name of comfort. Of course, not everyone had a personal fire or a warming pan. Peasants, ever the improvisers, used body heat as a central feature. Families, and sometimes livestock, cohabited in tight quarters, not for joy, but for strategic temperature sharing. It's warmth, yes, but it comes with the bonus aroma of damp hay and goats. The scent of survival. In larger Tudor homes, canopy beds with thick curtains were practical spaceships of insulation. Close the curtains, and you created a microclimate, warmed by breath, blankets, and sheer optimism. Servants heated bricks or stones in the fire and placed them at the foot of the bed, a technique that hissed smugly at cold air, daring it to intrude. Then there were the ever-resourceful Scandinavians who perfected cottage thermodynamics. Their log walls were thick, their beds nested in alcoves like sidecar saunas, and their winter logic impeccable. Chop wood, stay warm, repeat. In Finland, people even built saunas before homes. First the heat, then the house. Priorities in order. Let us also not overlook the warm embrace of hot drinks. Mulled wine, hot ale, or a simple herbal tisane, sipped by hearthlight, wrapped someone in a second warmth. Less warming than the fire, perhaps, but far more companionable. There's comfort in a steaming mug cupped between chilled hands, the scent mingling with firewood and candle wax, while shadows dance gently on the walls. And while the rich sipped, the ordinary folk sang. Whether to pass the time or keep spirits high, tunes echoed off timber walls. There's something deeply warm about many voices raised against the cold, harmonizing survival into song. It may not heat the stove, but it certainly kindled courage. So, in a world without glowing push buttons and programmable heat, people shaped their homes, their clothes, and their customs around fire. Often literal, occasionally romantic, and always necessary. But warmth didn't always stay indoors. In fact, when winter festivals arrived, people took to the bitter streets with surprising flair and a few ingenious tricks up their frostbitten sleeves. Somewhere in the wide and frosty embrace of 15th century Europe, a winter wind wheezed through the chinks of a timber-framed house, past a crisply shivering turnip in a root cellar, and directly into the ear of a mostly unamused shoemaker. His name was probably something like Hans, or maybe Willem, if we're being regionally adventurous, and the air was cold enough to legally count as an enemy. There was no central heating, not even a rebellious candle dared ask for overtime. And yet, people survived. Not just survived, they managed to grumble warmly through entire winters while, fascinatingly, possessing neither fleece onesies nor the modern marvel of microwavable heat packs disguised as plush hedgehogs. A great deal of this ancient perseverance was thanks to one invention so clever, it would make even the most smug inventor twirl their handlebar mustache in admiration. The bed. Yes, the humble bed. But not quite the one you're lying in now, all modern and flat and strangely untroubled by livestock. No, we're speaking of the medieval bed, a marvel of layered ingenuity. Beds in cold climates were built high, so high that stepping into them occasionally required either a stool or a minor miracle. This elevation wasn't just dramatic flair. Warm air rises, and the higher you slept, the toastier your dreams. Underneath the bed, children might sleep, or stores of grain, or possibly both, depending on how tidy one's household hierarchy was. The bedding itself was plush in its own gritty way. Straw mattresses were common, sometimes stuffed with feathers if luxury were an option, sometimes just straw if not. These were called palliaces, which sounds charming, until you realize you are probably sharing them with an entire ecosystem of tiny, itchy travel companions. Blankets layered like lasagna, wool, wool, and more wool. And then, the crown jewel, the bed curtain. Heavy fabric draped around the entire bed frame, turning the sleeping area into a warm little cave. These curtains did more than just keep out drafts. They also, helpfully, dim the awareness that your chamber pot was exactly 2.5 feet from your face. But the true winter champions, the sleeper's secret weapon, were warming pans. Imagine this. You're ready for bed. It's minus something bold outside. You call out, possibly with the vocal timbre of someone summoning dragons, "Fetch the warming pan." This pan made of metal and looking suspiciously like a pizza-making tool of judgment was filled with embers from the fire and slid between the sheets in careful serpent-like motions. The bed was preheated, medieval style. You just had to be quick enough to get under the covers before the warmth wandered off. Important footnote. Many warming pan incidents involved either scorched sheets, scorched mattresses, or scorched dignity if things got too ambitious. But still, worth it. In colder corners of the world, Sweden for instance, winter beds could become entire cocooned operations. The bed sofa, the Swedish version of a bed sofa hybrid, didn't exist yet, but people piled on pelts like Arctic lasagna. Bear skins, reindeer hides, even sheep stomachs if things got creative. And then there were the beds built into walls, box beds they're called, where one quite literally climbed into a cupboard. These were especially beloved in parts of France and Scotland, where huddling together inside, a wooden cupboard felt less like furniture and more like a long-term survival strategy. Entire families might sleep inside, converting bedtime into a communal toast. And let us pause for a moment of reverence for the medieval hot water bottle before hot water bottles existed. Enter the warmed brick. Simple, stoic, a bit gravelly on the edges. People would heat bricks by the hearth, wrap them in cloth, and slip them into their sheets, not unlike tucking a lava rock into your PJs and hoping it behaves. The comfort was brief but precious, much like most medieval meals. Now, as you float gently on thoughts of glowing fire embers and cozy cupboard beds, we drift toward another evening tale of unconventional coziness, one that smells distinctly like cabbage, soot, and whatever the family goat stepped in. Let's wander next to the warmth that came, rather unexpectedly, from below. As twilight settled over Europe's shivering past, and the moody warmth of the fireplace flickered, like a sleepy eyelid, people long before us were turning to a different, more portable kind of heat. Animals. And not just any animals, living, breathing, wool-covered, slightly judgmental animals. The oft-overlooked heating system of yore came trotting on hooves or curled up with a soft bleat. Yes, sheep. In centuries where insulation relied more on sheepdogs than sheetrock, it was entirely ordinary, if not particularly hygienic, to sleep with livestock. And not just for charm or ambient bar soundscapes. Each sheep could be counted not only for sleepless relief, but for thermal mass. One sheep could exhale enough warmth into a small cottage to make frost retreat, and a few of them clustered together could resemble a very slow, grass-powered space heater. Small-scale medieval farmers would often keep their most temperature-sensitive animals indoors with them, especially during winter. Think of it as invested snuggling. Chickens clucked quietly near the hearth, pigs grunted like blunt lullabies from beneath the benches, and cows were sometimes housed beneath raised wooden floors, letting their body heat seep upward like delicious bovine radiators. In Switzerland, this architectural style was called the stall house, a house over a stall, where winter involved cows downstairs making unintentional fondue from below. It may be dreamy to imagine dozing off in a thatched cottage with woolen creatures at your feet, but let us not romanticize the aroma. A cozy room containing 4 humans, 2 goats, and a duck was less Nordic spa and more peasant-level potpourri. Yet in their defense, nobody was cold. and they were doing the best they could before central heating and that little miracle we call Febreze. Outside the barn-like boundaries of medieval peasantry, aristocrats got a bit more decorative with their warmth. In Japan's Edo period, clever nobles wrapped tiny charcoal braziers in lacquered furniture. These stylish heaters, called hibachi, were more elegant than efficient, like warming your hands over burning incense. But they did the trick in a nation where paper walls were a design staple, and drafty temples were considered cozy hangouts. The Romans, ever suspicious of simple solutions, had upped the heating game long before most of these humble fixes were invented. With their togas flicking dramatically in strong Mediterranean breezes, the Romans pioneered the Hippocos system, a rather luxurious underfloor heating method used in bathhouses and wealthy villas. They built raised floors on pillars and allowed heat from wood-burning furnaces to travel beneath the surface. Imagine the anticipation of walking barefoot into your frigid marble atrium and discovering it's toasty. Truly, history's first heated yoga studio, minus the yoga, or the mats, or, let's be honest, the pants. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, people fought back against the cold, not with technology, but with textiles. Layering wasn't a fashion statement, it was an act of survival. In 17th century Scandinavia, you might start your day by putting on woolen undergarments, then woolen stockings, then a woolen tunic, and then, layered with spirit and pride, perhaps another woolen tunic. Elders said, "Dress like an onion." The phrase didn't survive, but the method certainly did. Add one more wool layer, and you could risk frostbite only emotionally. Fanciest of all were the heated beds. Before the days of mattress warmers and heated blankets powered by an optimistic cord, folks across Europe used bed warmers. These were flat, pan-like devices filled with hot coals and slipped between the sheets to preheat the mattress, like a human toaster for dreams. Caution was advised, as the romantic glow of embers beneath the blankets could quickly become a fiery visit from the local fire brigade, assuming they weren't frozen to their buckets. In cottages and castles alike, keeping warm wasn't passive. It was deliberate, daily, and sometimes whimsical. The cold was not just something you suffered, but something to befriend. It crept into bed with you, pleaded for extra layers, and made you appreciate the peculiar, radiant warmth of a sleepy goat nosing your elbow in the middle of the night. And as the chill deepened across stone cottages and snow-covered roofs, the silence of winter was occasionally stirred by one more thing: the communal hearth. Not just the place where wood crackled, but where stories crackled too. Stories of surviving seasons past, of old tricks gifted by ancestors, and of mysterious heat sources that made no smoke, left no ash, and glowed much stranger than any coal. Which brings us, softly, curiously, to an ancient secret that smoulders still in the pages of time. Somewhere between the clinking of medieval goblets and the quiet scraping of woolen socks on stone floors, people got cold. It was a universal truth. You could be a peasant with chilblains or a baron with a drafty castle, tower. But once the sun slipped away and the fire sputtered to embers, your options for warmth dwindled to some comically creative and questionably safe solutions. Enter the humble bed warmer, not to be confused with your cat, who may or may not have earned that title overnight. The historical bed warmer was a simple contraption involving metal, a long handle, and a very literal fire hazard. Picture this: a wide lidded brass pan, shiny if you were lucky, a bit sooty if you weren't, filled with hot embers, or, on more sensible days, smouldering coals. You tuck it under the bed covers and slide it around carefully, like an early version of ironing your mattress, minus any indication that a mattress likes being ironed. The catch? Sometimes the embers jump ship, and if your sheets were made of linen, as many were, you were one careless sizzle away from turning your night into a rousing example of how not to use fire indoors. Still, it was considered the height of sensible nighttime luxury, like having heated seats in your ox-drawn sleigh. Not fancy enough for you. Enter the Renaissance elite and their penchant for foot stoves. These were little wooden boxes with slatted tops you'd place under your skirts, filled with hot coals. Just you, your thoughts, layers of petticoat, and a wooden crate of tiny lava cubes. Elegant. Of course, not everything was char and ash. There were more aromatic methods. Herb-filled pillows, for instance. Lavender, thyme, chamomile. Bundled tightly into sachets and placed under bed covers to warm the spirit, if not your toes. These dream pillows were sometimes believed to even help with digestion or chase off nightmares involving tax collectors, or whatever haunted the 17th century soul. Now, if you were fortunate enough to be closer to the Arctic than to Rome, you might have encountered the supremely snug innovation of sleeping cloaks. Heavy, bear-like garments you could wear to bed, often with a hood deep enough to disappear inside like a turtle reconsidering its life choices. Picture a bedtime wizard, only colder and possibly French. Meanwhile, in East Asia, the ingenuity turned more elegant. In Japan, the kotatsu became a cherished friend. This low wooden table featured a heat source underneath, most classically, a brazier, and was draped with a warm quilt. Families would gather around it like cats to a sunny windowsill, tucking their legs beneath and staying there until someone grew brave enough to leave. Usually days later, and only out of absolute necessity, such as rice running out. In Korea, they engineered the ondol, a system so clever it might convince you that floor warming is a human right. Channels beneath stone floors carried smoke from the kitchen fire, heating the entire room evenly from below. It was warm, efficient, and made every other type of heating system feel like a cruel joke involving uneven hotspots and perpetually cold elbows. In colder parts of Europe, family warmth was often taken more literally. Multi-generational homes would sleep piggyback style on warmth, quite literally top to toe, side by side. You'd pile into bed with siblings, parents, or even the occasional visitor. Personal space was measured in body heat units. It wasn't cozy in the aesthetic Pinterest sense, but rather in the Old Norse, please don't let my toes freeze off sort of way. Even the architecture played its part. Low ceilings, thick tapestries, and cleverly placed hearths all conspired against winter's creeping teeth. Window panes, if you could afford them, were layered with oiled paper or heavy shutters. Glass was rare and needlessly transparent for keeping out the cold. It was ambience wrapped in practicality. Outside, in the bleak midwinter, you'd find hay-stuffed boots, frostbitten noses, and alcohol used more for warming than for revelry. Though, let's be honest, both were warmly welcomed. Glühwein, mulled cider, or a cup of anything strong enough to burn on the way down became medicinal by declaration, tradition, and necessity. People were endlessly inventive, insatiably chilly, and not above snuggling with livestock. Yes, in some rural homes, small animals, dogs, cats, chickens, even the occasional docile goat, earned a place at the foot of the bed, primarily as homegrown heating devices with occasional bleating. And somehow, through all this magical, fumbling discomfort, humanity survived the frost year after year. But speaking of magical discomfort, what did they do when they weren't indoors? when even the coldest home felt like a summer haven compared to the icy crush of the outside world. Well, let's gently step outside, shall we? In the cold embrace of a medieval January, there existed no thermostats to tweak, no ductwork to hum comfort into one's toes, and absolutely no heated blankets, unless you count a cat named Marmalade dozing on your chest. But the cleverness of humankind is nothing if not born from shivering necessity. And so, to understand how people once endured the frosted eyelashes of winter nights, let us step softly into the curious world of pre-electric insulation, of a very personal kind. Among the most charming and chuckle-worthy inventions was the humble bed warmer. No, not a person. Although arranged marriages occasionally doubled as insulation strategies. The bed warmer in question was often a long-handled, lidded brass pan, filled with hot coals from the hearth. This blazing saucer was swept between the covers just before bedtime, with the performance delicately balanced between warming the sheets and not scorching them, or oneself. It was quite possibly the medieval era's riskiest flirtation. May I warm your bed for you? Being equal parts gallant and inflammable. Further north, where the cold waltzed indoors with little resistance, Norwegians and Swedes perfected the art of layering, and no, not in clothing, though wool remained a national affection, but in bedding. The down-filled duvets and sheepskin throws stacked upon sleepers formed a cozy fortress so dense it often required a coordinated effort to exit. Families slept together for warmth too, not merely out of affection or lack of space, but as a joint campaign against frostbite. If you've ever tried spooning 6 people across one straw mattress beside a sluggish dog with gas, you begin to grasp the intimacy of communal heating. China, ever ahead of its time, innovated with more direct heating. The Kang, not to be confused with the martial arts of cuddling, though it often led to it, was a raised brick or stone platform built into homes. Beneath it ran flues connected to the stove in the kitchen. As dinner simmered, warm smoke snake danced beneath the surface of the Kang, heating it like a primitive radiant floor. Beds, entire meals, conversations, and occasionally footstool wrestling all took place atop these toasty slabs, which sometimes measured larger than the room itself. It was central heating, if you didn't stray more than 6 feet. But the truly odd comfort champions of the cold were found among the Victorians. Ah, the Victorians, a people who wore full corsets to breakfast and declared ankle sightings scandalous, but also invented coal-powered foot warmers and the indoor hot water bottle. These weren't the modern, rubbery fellows we picture, but instead made of ceramic or metal. Like adorable, somewhat menacing tea kettles you stuffed under your feet and hoped wouldn't explode. And let's not overlook the ever-stalwart chamber pot's cheerful cousin, the warming stone. Heated and wrapped in cloth, these stones were placed under blankets before bed like sleepy-time grenades of warmth. If used correctly, you were toasty. If used poorly, you woke with second-degree burns and a newfound dread of rocks. Of course, the greatest invention for warmth in the pre-electric age was arguably the nightcap, not the liquid kind, though hot ale was not frowned upon. No, the cloth variety. These soft, sock-like hats were worn to bed to prevent heat from escaping through the scalp. And really, what could be more fashionable than waking up looking like a 17th century mushroom? Paired with long nightshirts, heavy socks, and the aforementioned warm rocks, you had yourself a sleep ensemble befitting a gentleman, or at least a man pretending not to be freezing to death in his own home. And then there were the fireplaces, majestic but moody. While the hearth in the drawing room might blaze with pride, bedrooms often made do with smaller, sulkier cousins that puffed more smoke than heat. A roaring fire in one room meant another room chilled in protest. Heat was not so much distributed as inherited. If your bed happened to be in the warm room, congratulations. If not, well, Marmalade the cat would have to do. In some regions, homes were even partially buried, like hibernating mammals, where the earth itself served as insulation. Turf houses in Iceland, for instance, blended cozily into hillsides like hobbit tenements. Inside was dark, yes, but naturally warmed from the geothermal generosity lurking below. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was this quiet glow of human ingenuity that kept people warm as much as the flickering flames. Now, as the coals dim in our little brass pan and the nightcap slips slightly over one eyebrow, let's wander next into the world of what people wore inside these drafty wonder homes. Because staying warm wasn't just about stoking fires, it was very much about dressing like an onion. Layers await in the gentle hum of a 17th century winter, when snow piled like sleepy cats on thatched rooftops and drafty stone walls bristled with cold. The average European didn't have much to stand between themselves and frostbite, but an optimism bordering on reckless and whatever animals happened to be nearby. And I do mean animals in the most literal sense. Let us amble now, wrapped in a woolen shawl of curiosity, into the world of bed warmers, where the phrase "hot under the covers" took a rather unexpected turn. Before the advent of central heating, or even mildly effective fireplaces for that matter, keeping warm in bed was an exercise of sheer determination. The preferred method? Enter the bed warmer. Imagine a frying pan made of copper or brass, attached to a long wooden handle. Now fill it with hot coals. Congratulations, you are now wielding a historical fire hazard. Servants, often underpaid and disturbingly flammable, were tasked with dragging these ember-filled devices across the bed sheets before the master climbed in. The idea was simple: toast the space between the sheets to a bearable temperature before crawling in yourself. A noble quest. Also, a highly flammable one. Beds caught fire more often than you'd hope, and someone, somewhere, definitely invented roasted pajamas without meaning to. Now, for the more cautious, or perhaps less pyromaniac-inclined individuals, there existed the hot brick. This approach involved heating a brick in the fireplace until it reached surface of the sun levels, then wrapping it in cloth and stuffing it into the foot of the bed. It sounds unpleasant, but do remember, this was a time when footwear doubled as winter heating accessories. If your options are frost-gnawed toes or snuggling up to a brick burrito, you'd be surprised how romantic a brick can become. In colder regions, straw mattresses were stuffed to alarming puffiness, like sleeping atop a loaf of barley bread. And folks would curl up with not just the blankets and bricks, but, yes, living, breathing, slightly snoring bedfellows. This included spouses, children, and in especially frigid situations, livestock. Sheep weren't just wool producers, they were sleep buddies. A warm goat at your feet could mean the difference between a painful chill and a toasty midnight nap. And if your bed bleated in the dark, well, what of it? But nowhere did the art of cozy sleeping reach quite the visionary heights as in Japan, with the invention of the kotatsu. Ah yes, the kotatsu, a low wooden table frame covered by a heavy quilt, with a heat source underneath. Traditionally, a clay pot full of hot coals, and, in modern times, an electric heater. Families would gather beneath this tent of toasty marvel, often making no efforts to leave it for days. It remains one of humanity's greatest contributions to the concept of "I am warm, therefore I stay." While we're geographically meandering, allow me to drop in on Russia, home of some of the most committed heat seekers in history. Russian peasant houses, the izbas, boasted a source of warmth so efficient it managed both heating and sleeping in one go: the traditional masonry stove. These massive brick ovens were built in the center of homes and retained heat like a bear retains grudges. Children slept atop them. Cats claimed them with a look of feline smugness, and grandparents curled around them like moss on a sun-warmed rock. The stove wasn't merely an appliance, it was a lifestyle. Of course, the upper classes in many societies embraced entirely different methods. In French chateaux and English manor houses, warming pans were delicately wielded by household staff, beds were draped in layers of velvet and wool, and the idea of sleeping with livestock had fallen out of vogue, unless the livestock was wearing perfume and could hold a philosophical conversation over claret. Still, whether rich or poor, most people shared the same longing: to climb beneath a mound of warmth, to escape the prickle of frost on the windows, and to drift away into slumber with the comforting notion that at least some part of you, hopefully the toes, wasn't shivering. It's hard not to admire these old warming traditions, even if they occasionally set the curtains on fire or involved sleeping cheek to fleece with a deeply unimpressed goat. There's a kind of dreamy ingenuity at play, that interweaving of human need with the materials at hand, be it bricks, stoves, or the gentle radiance of a shared kotatsu. And so, with a low crackle of coals under copper, the scent of warming wool, and the faintest snore of a sheep in the corner, we slip further into the coziness of the past, where each flicker of warmth carried a story. Next, we'll draw the curtains back on the world of undergarments, which were surprisingly influential in surviving a snowstorm or a dinner party. Before we had central heating, and I mean the glorious modern kind where a thermostat obeys your every whim, people worked a lot harder and thought more creatively to fend off the cold. But few methods achieve such strange elegance as the use of bed warmers. Tonight, we draw the thick curtains of time and peek into the rather toasty underworld of sleeping arrangements when bed became a battlefield against cold, drafts, and winter's icy fingers. Now, the basic idea of a bed warmer was simple. Take something hot, put it in something safer, and tuck it under or inside the bed before climbing in. It's the historical equivalent of preheating the oven, except the oven is your mattress, and you are a somewhat anxious turkey, hoping not to wake up with third-degree burns. We begin with the good old brass bed warmer. Imagine, if you will, a shallow pan, round and shiny, with a long wooden handle. This was filled with hot coals or embers from the fireplace. The lid had holes to let out the excess heat, though not smoke, ideally. One would swish or glide the pan between the sheets with the elegance and danger of a ballroom dancer holding a flaming pie. It was effective, yes, but carried a risk of scorched linens, singed eyebrows, and in rare but impressive cases, a small bedroom blaze, because nothing tucks you in quite like a minor inferno. And then there were the wealthier sleepers. These were the nighttime aristocrats who used beds so massive they might qualify as studio apartments today. Warming an entire royal bed could require multiple servants and a keen avoidance of setting the drapes aflame. In France, one noblewoman reportedly insisted her sheets be warmed with bricks wrapped in ermine fur. That's right, nothing says contentment like baking your mattress with stones dressed fancier than most people at a wedding. Meanwhile, in colonial America, the foot warmer was all the rage. It resembled a little wooden box, often lined with tin or iron, filled with glowing embers and carried like a purse full of danger. These boxes travelled to church, tucked under pews during those 3-hour sermons in frosted sanctuaries, and then, delightfully, went to bed with you. There's something quaint about bringing your own portable heat source. A cozy revolution fought one ember at a time. But let us not forget the humble bedfellow of the masses, hot water bottles. These early types were often made from metal and sometimes shaped like miniature submarines. Filled with boiling water and tightly sealed, hopefully, they'd be placed at weary feet like loyal sentinels of warmth. Of course, should one leak, well, the results ranged from a nocturnal yelp to a very soggy 18th century bedtime. Over time, rubber replaced metal, and these water bottles took on the familiar pear-shaped look we now associate with vintage cartoon illnesses. People even knitted charming sweaters for them, because in the age before central heat, you didn't just warm your bed, you accessorized your warmth. In some places, especially rural communities, people went full-on agrarian with their heating strategies, such as using heated stones wrapped in cloth. These were plucked directly from the hearth or oven, and then bundled tightly in linen or wool to avoid direct burns. It was rustic, it was practical, and it bore a certain poetic quality, like cradling a sunbeam just before sleep. And then there were sleeping arrangements driven not by accessories, but by proximity. People, especially in colder climates, simply slept together. Not in a raucous way, mind you, but purely for warmth. Entire families snuggled up like an earnest stack of pancakes, radiating body heat and shared dreams. There's even an old English phrase, 3-dog night, a level of cold that required not 1, not 2, but 3 dogs in bed with you to stay warm. A canine heating trifecta. Of course, before you consider this charming, remember these were not your dainty designer pups wearing sweaters that cost more than rent. These were working, muddy, possibly slightly damp farm dogs. But when frost whispered against the windows, their snoring was the lullaby of survival. As the fires of these ancient warmers flicker low in the hearth of memory, let us drift now into softer climes, where warmth arrives not from coals or copper, but from curious wells of innovation and something far more unexpected. In a world before thermostats and fleece-lined everything, winter's bite was met not with the click of a dial, but with the creative, slightly singed ingenuity of the human race. And among the silent heroes in this toasty tale, few glow quite as brightly or clumsily as the story of hot water bottles. Now picture it, a foggy London evening, perhaps the 1700s, when coal smoke tangled with your eyelashes and your only hope against the chill was something hot near your ankles. Enter the bed warmer, predecessor of the modern hot water bottle, though bottle is rather generous. These early contraptions looked more like flattened kettles, metal pans, usually brass or copper, filled not with water, but with hot coals or embers scooped from the hearth. Yes, hot coals. And yes, people shoved them into their beds. The bed warmer was an instrument of both comfort and suspense. It featured a long handle, like a saucepan that had grown, aspirations of becoming a sword, and was often wielded by a weary servant or an ever-hopeful housewife. The glowing coals within would be coaxed into these metal tins, which were then slid between the sheets just before bedtime to warm them up. Provided the mattress didn't catch fire, it worked marvelously. Some families got creative and placed the embers inside ceramic pots shaped like plump cats or modest jugs, which occasionally cracked under the pressure of over-enthusiastic heating. Nothing says winter coziness like a ceramic cat exploding at your feet. As time went on and fire hazards became less fashionable, people began heating water instead of coal. They poured it into tough, inflated pig's bladders, or if you were really fancy, rubber. Early rubber hot water bottles entered the scene in the 19th century, offering all the heat of their metal ancestors with fewer scorch marks. Marketers of the day touted them as sanitary, sensible, and reliable, though they neglected to mention that they also smelled like old tires and had a habit of leaking precisely when placed in one's lap. Inventors, ever determined to eliminate minor inconveniences like sudden scalding or bed saturation, got to work improving the design. One 1903 patent boasted an improved neck design to allow easier filling, which made it at least 10% less likely to spill boiling liquid on the user's hand. Progress, after all, is measured in small victories. But the beauty of the hot water bottle wasn't just in the warmth it offered. It was in its sheer versatility. Victorians didn't stop at feet. Oh no. Aching backs, throbbing bellies, even melancholic hearts. Many claimed a well-placed hot water bottle could soothe it all. One gentleman allegedly slept with 3, one at his feet, one on his chest, and one cradled like a teddy bear. He called it his triangle of tranquility. His poor butler called it that ridiculous triangle again. Interestingly, in some parts of rural Europe, people crafted hot bricks instead. Flat stones or bricks would be heated in or near the hearth, then wrapped in cloth and gently slid into the bed like shy, warm pets. These bricks were the introverts of the warming world, silent, dependable, and not at all likely to gurgle ominously in the night. If you needed toastiness with a side of quiet charm, the hot brick was your gentle companion. Children especially grew attached to their warming devices. Tiny red rubber bottles became cherished bedtime buddies, their comforting heat a reminder that someone had prepared this humble luxury with care. It's oddly touching to think of how, even before microwavable plushies and electric blankets, warmth was always something crafted by hand, with patience and a slight risk of third-degree burns. By the early 20th century, hot water bottles were household mainstays in chilly climates, and even came with quilted covers, embroidered with everything from kittens to the phrase, "to my Valentine," ensuring that even scalding burns could be delivered with a touch of romance. Eventually, of course, boilers and radiators spread across cities like warm gossip, and the necessity of hot water bottles waned. But they never disappeared entirely. Even today, you'll find them clutched by cold fingers, slipped into beds in drafty mountain cabins, or lovingly restored by enthusiasts who like their heating with a little history. And tucked beneath all those warm layers, quilts, bricks, bottles, and the slightly smoky memory of bed warmers past, is the quiet, noble effort humans have always made to transform cold nights into cozy ones. Speaking of smoky memories, let's drift next toward a flickering tradition that promised warmth, charm, and on occasion, a little bit of soot in your soup. There's an almost poetic rhythm to the way people used to prepare for winter in centuries past. The preparations began long before the first true frost, with a kind of seasonal choreography, quiet, intentional, and slightly itchy. And speaking of itchy, allow us a soft, wool-lined segue into one of history's warmest topics, undergarments. Specifically, the layered world of what folks wore under everything else when temperatures dropped. Long before central heating and fleece-lined onesies, warmth was all about strategy, layers, and lots of them. In medieval Europe, for instance, the base layer was often a linen shift or chemise. Linen, though not insulating, was praised for, shall we say, its absorbent diplomacy. since bathing in winter was rare and risky. You wouldn't want to catch a chill, or worse, accidentally crack a rib sneezing in a frozen tub. Linen was the barrier between your noble self and the wool that followed. Ah, wool, that perennial hero in our tale of thermal survival. Peasants and nobles alike relied on woolen tunics, cloaks, and hose. Granted, peasants wore the rough kind that gave your thighs an unsolicited exfoliation, while the wealthy enjoyed the dreamy embrace of finer weaves. Think of it as the difference between a budget airline blanket and one that whispers sweet nothings in cashmere. In Viking settlements, where cold graduated to something a bit more existential, men and women wore several tunics layered over one another. Historians suggest they even wore woolen leg wrappings, like warm ribbons snugly coiled down the calves, turning legs into something resembling spicy medieval candy canes. But one mustn't forget the toes. Before the invention of the sock as we know it, people made do with foot wraps. Long strips of cloth wound around each foot like a tiny mummy. The unruly ones among us might ask, why not just invent socks sooner? To which history replies, have you ever tried knitting on a spinning wheel while your hands are numb and the goats won't cooperate? Speaking of unruly goats, there's our segue into noble pelts. Fur had a pretty solid PR department in colder regions. In Russia, fur was practically a second currency. Aristocrats would strut about draped in sable, ermine or fox, some of which still had the faces attached. Nothing says, don't speak to me unless spoken to, like a muff made from the entire head of an Arctic fox. In Siberia, peasants wore reindeer hides with the fur turned inward, creating rather efficient, if slightly fragrant, thermal cocoons. Meanwhile, in Edo period Japan, when winters crept quietly into paper-thin homes, people opted for hanten or tanzen. Padded jackets that looked much like today's sleeping bag had a love child with a bathrobe. Stuffed with cotton and stitched into delightful geometric patterns, these jackets became essential, wrapping their wearers in layers of quiet dignity and probable lint. Now, just to the west in rural China, an earthier approach to warmth was taken. Literally. Earthen beds, called kang, were built with hollow spaces beneath, where a fire would be lit to warm the whole stone structure. A family would sleep together on the kang, snuggled close like not-so-wild animals hibernating, dreaming, and occasionally waking to re-stoke the coals before they all turned into human ice cubes. Of course, layering was not a mere private domestic activity. Medieval Europeans, particularly the weavers' guilds, took inner warmth to flamboyant outer extremes. Ever heard of slash sleeves? A fashion trend in the 15th century involved cutting holes in the top layer of fabric to let the colourful, warmer layers underneath peek through, functional and fabulous. Rather like the historical equivalent of, I am absolutely freezing, but you will still notice me. And then, dear listener, there is perhaps the most inventively toasty tradition: heated clothing inserts. Long before battery-powered warmers, people tucked hot bricks, boiled potatoes, or iron plates inside cloth wrappings and stashed them inside their tunics. Just imagine walking around with a baked spud nestled against your chest. Not exactly haute couture, but certainly haute enough for January. So how did people stay warm before electricity? They bundled, layered, wrapped, tucked, stitched, boiled, and occasionally borrowed warmth from livestock with deeply questionable boundaries. They did what they had to, all while maintaining a sense of style, or at the very least, no visible frostbite. And still, despite all the ingenuity, there remained a universal truth. At night, No matter your status or wool budget, you needed a bed that didn't leave you frostbitten by sunrise. Which leads us gently to our next historical comfort: the art of sleeping warm in ancient beds, curious contraptions, and curious practices that turned cold nights into cozy dreams. In the flickering quiet of medieval Europe, while outside the castle walls the wind rehearsed its howl for winter's opera, those inside turned to an invention both humble and ingenious: the bed curtain. Before central heating strutted onto the scene with all its duct-laden bravado, the average human had to summon warmth the old-fashioned way, by trapping it. And nothing trapped heat quite like a hefty canopy bed, swathed in drapes thick enough to double as defensive armor in a particularly aggressive pillow fight. These curtains, more luxurious in castles, more homespun in cottages, weren't there for drama, although they did inadvertently lend every nap a certain Shakespearean gravitas. They served as a mini climate zone, a microcosm of warmth, where your breath could bounce off the fabric and return as a warm hello. In lordly chambers, these beds were so grand they resembled small wooden fortresses, four-poster constructions with carved finials and the solemn dignity of a bored bishop. Behind the curtains, warmth gathered like gossip at a medieval banquet, huddling close to the body and rarely escaping, unless someone, usually an ill-timed cat, lifted the flap. But let's not imagine everyone snoozed surrounded by velvet and courtly luxury. Many folks, especially those whose bank accounts consisted mostly of chickens, had simpler setups. They used homespun wool curtains, patchworked quilts, or even hung rough blankets from pegs around the bed. Still, the idea was the same: trap the body's heat and keep the frosty air where it belonged, on the other side of the fabric, grumbling. Some families even shared beds, piling in like logs in a firewood stack. It was as much about conserving warmth as it was about conserving space. The hierarchy of who slept closest to the middle could be a matter of both comfort and family politics. These nights, spent shoulder to shoulder in a patchwork nest, were kept warm not only by body heat, but by 1,000 whispered conversations, snores, and the gentle battlegrounds of shared blankets. In especially modest homes, there were box beds built into the walls. Think cozy wooden cupboards where people quite literally tucked themselves in. Sliding panels could be shut to ward off chilly drafts or nosy livestock. These beds were snug, dark, and profoundly private, forming a wooden womb of sorts where dreams bloomed like frost flowers. Meanwhile, some inventive souls took insulating matters into their own hands and skirts. Imagine, if you will, the humble petticoat. Far from a frilly afterthought, layers of woolen petticoats were another underrated method of personal insulation. The more layers, the toastier, and the louder every step became. Entire social classes rustled like dry leaves in autumn, announcing themselves with a flump of centuries-old insulation technique. But perhaps the most gallant of all warm-blooded inventions was the bedfellow known as the warming pan. Picture this: a metal pan with a long handle filled with glowing embers or hot coals, slid carefully between the sheets before bed. It was like a slow dance with fire, where the object was to not get burned or set your mattress alight. A responsible member of the household, usually a servant with steady hands and a saintly patience for ironing out hot spots, would perform the pre-sleep ritual of warming the bed, scooting the pan under the covers, and then out again, ideally before setting anything ablaze. It was like kindling a relationship, but with fewer feelings and more scorching. The ghosts of practicality roam these bedchambers, hovering near the drafty eaves and chimney cracks, reminding occupants to sew shut holes in the thatch or reinforce the windows with oiled parchment. Some households hung tapestries on the walls not for aesthetic flair, but as insulation devices. These woven scenes, depicting pastoral bliss or biblical mayhem, weren't just for storytelling. They were medieval bubble wrap for the walls. And so, with heat sealed lovingly in by curtain or cupboard, charcoal or cousin, winter nights passed more warmly than logic might suggest. People, bundled against the chill, found ways to conjure comfort in the most charmingly inventive ways. They didn't just survive the cold, they snuggled their way through it. Now, take one last look at the edge of those old drapes, whispering their sleepy secrets. Beyond them waits another forgotten contraption of warmth, one that paved the way for a toasty revolution in underfoot luxury. In the swirling snows and crackling frost of the medieval European winter, there arose a peculiar knight, Sir Thomas of Thermodynamics, unofficially dubbed so due to his refusal to go questing until the hearth was throwing off enough heat to roast half a deer. Let us be honest, before central heating, surviving winter was less about daring deeds and more about not freezing your chainmail off. So what did people do to stay warm in the grandeur of drafty stone castles and humble timber homes that let in more wind than a broken lute? They layered. Oh, did they layer? Wool on linen, linen on wool, fur wherever possible, and there was no shame in looking like a walk-in closet. Even well-to-do lords prized their cloaks lined with ermine or fox, while peasants made do with sheepskin, or less prestigiously, a really determined family of mice that had moved in near their shoulders. But warmth did not come solely from what you wore. It also came from where you sat. In large manor houses, the family would gather in the great hall near the central hearth, sharing both stories and body heat in the kind of familial arrangement that made personal space a myth. The farther from the fire, the more likely you were to develop intimate relationships with icicles forming on your elbows. In many medieval Germanic and Scandinavian dwellings, the fire pit was centrally positioned with a smoke hole above, the kind of architectural solution that only half worked, since the other half involved breathing in mild smoke for the majority of your adult life. It was warm, yes, but it gave everyone the smoky aroma of brisket, whether or not they were dinner. Meanwhile, in kitchens, those natural hothouses of the home, folks often poked around long after the stew had finished, feigning culinary interest as an excuse to bask near the mighty oven. It was less, I'm helping with dinner, and more, I'm using dinner as a moderately acceptable excuse to warm my extremities. But allow us now to step beyond the continent, to a monarchy famously obsessed with manners and weather, England. Ah, the Tudor bedchamber. A place where tapestries, feather beds, and canopied four-posters were not frivolous decor, but strategic defenses against the bitter draughts that slithered like gossip through even noble walls. Bed curtains, when drawn, created a microclimate. Some even claimed they were the invention of genius, though that genius probably still wore 3 pairs of socks to bed and complained about his toes. The truly ambitious built beds large enough to fit the entire family, and some guests in what became known as the family bed, a name that sounds heartwarming until you imagine 5 snoring relations and a chamber pot you have to sidestep like a medieval game of hopscotch at 3 a.m. Let's not forget the preserving power of pets. Cats slept on feet, dogs curled into crevices, and chickens. Well, if you were rural enough, sometimes even the chickens provided warmth. It's important to remember that love, loyalty, and the 102-degree body temperature made for enduring companions. And then, perhaps the most enduring and endearing technique of them all, the humble hot water bottle. Though less modern silicone squish and more metal flask wrapped in flannel, the early warming pans were filled with embers or hot water and tucked between bed linens to preheat the sheets. Sometimes, of course, these pans had ideas of their own and went up in smoke. The price of early comfort came with the fine print. Warning: mild to moderate bed arson. Moving still, further afield, in the mountains of Japan, there was the kotatsu, a low table frame covered by a heavy blanket, with a small heat source underneath. Families would sit beneath this cozy contraption, slowly being absorbed into its warmth like marshmallows in a mug of cocoa. Only great motivation, or perhaps the force of nature itself, could cause someone to leave the embrace of a kotatsu by choice. But perhaps one of the oddest and most charming methods of warmth was the so-called warming kiss, a method popularized in cold French manners, where couples might stretch out for an evening of whispering beneath fur spread across their laps, trading body heat through proximity, breath, and the occasional shared jug of warm wine. The idea, of course, was to stay warm. The side effect was 9 children. As the wind howled beyond thick stone and thinner thatch, and as the fire sank to glowing orange cinders, humanity stayed warm the only ways it knew, with layers, with laughter, with livestock, and with love. And as we gently drift away from the smoke-swirled halls of medieval Europe, our next fireside path leads us somewhere altogether different, where the cold is less damp, and the solutions for warmth take a twist you might not expect. Goose fat. Yes, let's begin with that. History has offered us countless wonders: mathematics, cathedrals, suspender belts. But few are quite as devotedly slimy as the practice of smearing warm goose fat on one's extremities for warmth. This particular delight was once a trusted cold defense system in certain regions of Europe, especially among those who couldn't afford wool stuffing or didn't happen to have a bearskin lying about. The promise of goose fat was that it created a lovely, greasy barrier between frigid air and fragile flesh. And, as a culinary bonus, you always smelled delicious, like a walking roast dinner. Now, while noblemen might scoff at such a peasant's remedy, lounging in their oiled, leather boots beside roaring hearths wider than most cottages, there's something to be said for the humble ingenuity of the common folk. They had neither marble floors nor tapestries of battles that never happened, but they had pigs, they had fires, and above all, they knew how to make do. Speaking of pigs, there exists a rather curious medieval tale. And yes, more folklore than fact, but we like those here, of families keeping their smaller pigs indoors during especially cruel winters. The warmth of a pig, after all, is not to be underestimated. They run hot, snort honestly, and don't object when you hang your mittens near them. There's even rumour that some peasants, those enterprising peasants who specialise in comfort, developed a rotational sleeping schedule, taking turns leaning up against their chunky farm friends like portable heat units with trotters. The pigs were happy for the attention, the humans happy for the warmth. Meanwhile, further north in the Scandinavian lands where knitting needles were forged of steel and tea cooled before it was poured, there arose the noble tradition of the hygge, though they didn't yet call it that. Candles flickering, sheepskin throws tucked around shoulders, endless coffee, essentially an ancient version of Pinterest, with more soot and fewer mugs that say, "Live, laugh, love." In Viking longhouses, clever architecture was warmth's greatest ally. One central hearth heated the entire structure, and smoke, while it may have gently choked Grandma on her way to the stew pot, found its path through roof vents in time. Beds were piled high with furs, usually from animals now considered rather majestic in nature documentaries, and absolutely not free range. But back then, if it had fur, it was fair game for blanket potential. Still, personal warmth was but half the battle. Entire communities collaborated for collective survival. In places like Russia and Eastern Europe, the venerable pechka, a great, big belly of a masonry stove, became the heart of village life. More than an appliance, it was part heater, part cooking range, and in many cases, part bed. Children were often placed atop these warm platforms to sleep, sometimes layered in so many blankets that if they rolled over, they'd form their own microclimate. And what of England? Ah, England, the land of drafty castles and stubborn pride. In the 17th and 18th centuries, upper-class ladies often wore dresses with so much padding, crinoline, and various fabric flaps that they were effectively human insulation systems. Grand manor houses had fireplaces in every room, but only if you were upstairs. Servants often slept in kitchens or attics, spaces where warmth was either baked in or absolutely non-existent. Stone walls, thin blankets, and, for warmth, their own ingenuity. Layering was a life skill, and many a scullery maid had more petticoats than a duchess. Because layers, dear listener, are history's coziest invention. Even in Japan, the eternal elegance of simplicity yielded cleverness. Enter the kotatsu, a low wooden table covered with a blanket and heated from underneath by a charcoal brazier, or later, electricity. We won't talk about electricity just yet, mind you, but it's buzzing softly on the horizon. For now, imagine families gathered around the kotatsu, feet tucked under like cats curling in sunbeams, sharing steamy bowls of soup and the warmth of belly laughter. So much of staying warm before electricity was about craft, culture, and community. It was the fine art of gathering together, bundling up, inventing, adapting, and occasionally rubbing yourself with poultry fat. History isn't always pretty, but it is impressively warm when it wants to be. And now, if you listen closely, you might just hear the pop and hiss of a 19th century oil stove, quietly entering stage left. But more on that, very soon, in the quiet heart of a medieval winter, when the darkness stretched like a lazy cat across endless hours of night, the humble fireplace reigned supreme. It was the murmuring monarch of warmth, its glowing embers holding back the chill of stone walls and drafty timber beams. But just as every sovereign needs a court, the fireplace had its entourage. Clever human tricks and age-old contraptions that help people stay deceptively warm when the sun forgot to do its job. One of the lesser-sung heroes of pre-electric coziness was the medieval bed itself. A raised platform swaddled in furs, fluffed with straw-stuffed mattresses, and sometimes even equipped with its own miniature curtains. That's right, bed curtains weren't strictly for royalty or romantic drama. They were practical tools to trap human heat inside and keep the drafts of an undependable ceiling firmly out. If you were wealthy, or at least lucky enough to have been born to someone wealthy, you might enjoy the luxury of a feather bed, tucked above a trundle filled with straw. Add to that a hefty pile of woolen, sheepskin, or even fur blankets, and you'd be cozy enough to withstand the winter's whispers rattling at your shutters. Of course, all those layers came at a cost. Turning over in bed made the same effort level as rolling a baked potato inside an overstuffed burrito. Even medieval love stories were slightly less steamy if you had to wrestle through 3 feet of bedding just to hold someone's hand. daytime brought different challenges. The fire continued to crackle, but fireplaces in the early centuries were more about drama than direction. The smoke didn't always go politely up the chimney. It often took a casual stroll across the room first. It gave every chamber a permanent eau de campfire aroma, with occasional instances of accidental smoke inhalation. To stay mobile and warm, folks turned to fashionable layering. The art of dressing in layers goes way back, long before that one kid in your middle school who wore 12 hoodies for fun. In the 14th and 15th centuries, women wore multiple gowns, one over another, while men piled on tunics, hose, cloaks, and occasionally entire sheep, if folk art is to be believed. Wool, of course, was the fabric MVP. It was breathable, insulating, mostly waterproof, and could double as a pillow in case of spontaneous marginal naps. In colder regions, people wore fur linings or don cloaks lined with squirrel pelts, including a particularly cuddly variety from Russia known as vair. Vair was so popular, in fact, that it ended up in fairy tales, mistranslated into glass slipper, leading one poor translator to assign Cinderella a pair of truly impractical footwear for winter evenings. Headwear played a starring role too. Nothing is quite so charming as medieval headgear on a cold morning. People donned hoods, coifs, and woolen caps, shaped sometimes like pastry confections, other times like cousins of today's beanie hats. Some looked as though the wearer might accidentally be knighted by mistake. But perhaps one of the most delightfully unexpected heating contraptions was the humble bed warmer. Not to be confused with a friendly dog, though plenty of those were also employed for warmth. A bed warmer was often a flat, long-handled brass pan filled with glowing coals. It was gently slipped between the sheets just before bed, swished about to distribute the heat evenly, and then removed before anyone accidentally started a blanket bonfire. Nothing says romance like handing someone a coal pan instead of a goodnight kiss. Beyond beds and fashion, homes themselves lent a helping hand, or rather, a helping wall. In places like Russia and Finland, enormous masonry stoves, also known as tile stoves, were engineered to hold warmth like a friendly bear in hibernation. These thermal wonders stored heat from a single burn and slowly released it throughout the day and night. Some families even slept directly atop them, draping blankets over the warm tiles and calling it luxury. Who needs Netflix when you've got floor-heated dreams? And yes, let's not forget that warmth came from togetherness too. In large families or small homes, you often shared beds not just with your spouse, but with siblings, cousins, and occasionally visiting clerics. Personal space was more of a philosophical concept than a practical one. The upside? You could skip a few logs on the fire if your family budget was tight on wood. Now, as the fire begins to crackle down to soft glows and ember size, let's nestle deeper into the days when warmth wasn't a thermostat away, but an art form shaped by ingenuity, closeness, and a few really good socks. And as our story tiptoes forward, we shall find ourselves outside the home once again, where staying warm meant braving wind, snow, and the occasional extremely unfriendly goat. As the bitter chill of winter tiptoed across the fields and through the crooked chimneys of centuries past, there existed a curious contraption known only to the most dedicated draft dodgers and frost foes of the 18th and 19th centuries, the bed warmer. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sounds cozy, perhaps romantic. But alas, imagine not a cuddly heated blanket, but rather, essentially, a small brass frying pan with a long wooden handle, filled with burning embers, quietly smouldering its way through the sheets. Yes, indeed. Before you thank your modern thermostat and kiss your electric blanket goodnight, spare a moment for those who wielded a smouldering skillet under the covers just to chase away the cold. It was a game of speed and grace, inserting the sizzling pan under the blankets just long enough to warm, but not so long as to ignite a mattress fire, a warm bed, or a burnt one. Quite the gamble. The comforting uncertainty of historical bedtime. Bed warmers weren't a solo act either. There was usually a servant tasked with the job, reminding us yet again that history rarely offers comfort without a hierarchy involved. The servant would prepare the coals, sometimes adding fragrant herbs for a pleasing scent, like lavender, which honestly is a thoughtful touch when you're already tiptoeing so close to catastrophe. But bed warmers weren't the only weapon wielded in the war against winter. Across Europe and Asia, one of the most beloved inventions for keeping the cold at bay came straight from the soil itself: the hot water bottle. Originally, many were made of metal, and again, warmed rather daringly with boiling water. Still, when placed properly, beneath thick woolen sheets or under a skirt, they performed miracles, and in the right hands, or more accurately, the right toes, they became loyal companions through unyielding nights. In fact, medieval manuscripts sometimes reference monks sleeping with heated stones wrapped in cloth. What we might call the DIY hot water bottle of its time. Plucked from the hearth and carried with gloved reverence to the bedside, these stones did their best not to cool too quickly or crack, or, in the worst case, singe the sleepers unsuspecting behind. Meanwhile, in lands where wood was precious and winters were stubborn, societies got awfully clever. In Korea, homes were built with a brilliant underfloor heating system called the ondol, a design that dates back more than 2,000 years. It worked by channeling the heat from a kitchen fire through passageways underneath the house, warming the stones embedded in the floor. In the cold months, families would sleep directly on the heated floor with padded mats, warm from below and wrapped in blankets above. This ingenious system did double duty, letting families cook their rice and their toenails in one unified motion. Efficient, reliable, and nothing caught fire. Take that, brass pans. In China, they had their own take, the Kang bed stove. Essentially, a brick platform fired from within by flues connected to a central fire, allowing the entire surface to radiate warmth gently through the night. Families might spend nearly all their winter hours on the Kang, eating, sleeping, gossiping, and, I must imagine, occasionally arguing about who forgot to restoke the main fire. Even the humble cat found its way into this story. The French once had a term, chaufferette à chat, essentially a lap warmer with a cat. Why rely on machinery when you had a live purring sunbeam who preferred the radiator of your lap anyway? And back in the chillier corners of England, some turned to clay jars filled with hot water, corked and slipped under the covers with care. These too evolved into the classic rubber hot water bottles we so often romanticize. And yes, even those came with stern Victorian warnings. Do not, under any circumstance, hug them too tight. Rubber could fail. Sleep could be wet. Dignity, irrecoverable. Some inventive souls went a step further and wore their own heating devices, like ceramic waist warmers hung with straps, essentially leashed pottery, or tiny coal-filled boxes that dangled from belts. These mobile warmers turned walking into a cautious shuffle, as embers trembled with every step. One wrong jostle and you might find yourself briskly on fire. And yet, for all their crackling hazards and brisk imagination, these ancient warming methods were a testament, to humanity's refusal to shiver, to complain quietly but invent loudly, and to eke out comfort while the wind howled like a theatre critic outside the window. Now the embers are low, and we've tucked our brass pans away. But warmth has another face, and in the next breath, we'll follow it into the world of winter food, and how stew, bread, and a proper cup of something hot became the ultimate fireplace in your belly. The wind outside howled like a lonely poet trapped in a snowdrift, while inside, a different kind of poetry warmed the world. Wool. Yes, humble, scratchy, oft complained about wool. Before, the age of glowing thermostats and heated floors, mankind draped itself in the fleece of sheep and called it winter fashion. Let us begin with the medieval wool tunic. Essentially, a wearable blanket with a belt thrown on for flair. These tunics weren't just fashion statements, they were survival suits. The wool was neither soft nor svelte, but it had character. The kind of character that could stand up to a rainstorm, a snow squall, and, if needed, a rather bland village festival. Medieval peasants bundled up in layers upon layers, often looking like a stack of old quilts, gained sudden sentience. Now, of course, wool isn't only for peasants. Even royalty wrapped themselves in it, though theirs was typically dyed some forbidden colour like crimson regret or blue the church frowns upon. The difference? The upper cross wool was, well, less itchy, allegedly. They could afford mercers who'd beat the fabric into softness, or at least submission, before it wrapped around royal shins. And let's not forget the mighty wool sock, perhaps the single most important invention in the history of not getting frostbite. Entire embroidery guilds in Renaissance cities specialized in fancy woolen hose, because having warm feet and status was the medieval version of having heated car seats. But wool wasn't just worn, it was weaponized. In households across Britain, the practice of wool layering emerged not as art, but as tactical defense against bone-chilling drafts. One would start with a base layer of flannel, then perhaps a second shift of wool, followed by a surcoat, capuchon, scarf, mitts, and finally, as the pièce de résistance, a woolen robe that made you look like the druid wizard of central heating. All of which brings us to an unsung hero of history, the bed curtain. Ah yes, the bed curtain. The medieval solution to living in a house where the only private space was, well, wherever curtains happened to be, rich or poor. If you could string fabric around your sleeping quarters, you had yourself a microclimate. Four-poster beds weren't just for dramatic reveals in period dramas. They were cozy enclosures designed to trap body heat and block out the disturbing sights of your cousin, waking up across the room with hair shaped like a medieval haystack. In colder climes like Scandinavia, the Norse took pragmatic coziness to mythic heights. They built buttery warm longhouses, sometimes sharing them with livestock. Yes, actual cows in the house. And here begins a cuddly secret of old world heating: living radiators. Cows, pigs, even chickens contributed more than breakfast. They raised the ambient temperature just a bit. With enough chickens underfoot, you could border on toasty, though breakfast occasionally wandered off. And what about feet? Oh, humans have been inventing sock-based solutions for as long as toes have existed. In ancient Japan, there were tabi, the split-toe socks worn inside straw, sandals, and presumably also huddled up at night under paper-thin walls. Meanwhile, early Turkish households handmade caliks, spool-knitted sock booties so excessively padded they may have caused afternoon naps by accident. In Eastern Europe, grandmothers, those eternal sentinels of warmth, developed cross-generational sock-passing traditions. Some socks, thick as pastries and smelling only faintly of mothballs and mystery, could last decades. To receive your grandmother's warming socks was both an honor and a commitment, as it was highly discouraged to ever wash them. Interestingly, some ancient cultures didn't rely on wool or fire alone. They turned to hot stones. Heated in coals and wrapped in cloth, these geological companions were nestled into footbeds or straw mattresses at night. Think of it as pre-electric heating pad, only heavier and occasionally prone to incinerating the blanket. A small price to pay for cozy toes. Of course, no discussion of historic warmth would be complete without mentioning the long, honorable lineage of communal sleeping. Forget your modern ideas of personal space. Historically, everyone just piled in. Families, servants, pets, and the occasional confused neighbor. Body heat worked wonders when insulation hadn't yet been invented, and snoring was just a lullaby with rhythm. And so, while wool remained the undisputed monarch of winter survival, humanity also gathered warm stones, huddled with livestock, and wrapped themselves in shared blankets of necessity, surviving long winters with ingenuity, determination, and the kind of cuddling that would trigger 1,000 HR conversations today. Now, speaking of warm stones tucked under straw beds, and the even stranger ways people turned bedtime into radiators, you might want to keep those eyes closed just a little longer. Among the more peculiar things humans have done in the gentle pursuit of warmth, perhaps none stand so nobly ridiculous as the saga of the bed curtain. Not to be confused with the dignified stage curtain, which offers drama and revelation. The bed curtain offered only two things: mystery and muffled sniffles. Picture a grand four-poster bed, timbered and tasseled, draped in thick velvet or wool, like a particularly ambitious evening gown laid out to sleep. These weren't just for aristocrats who had surplus privacy to squander. In colder zones, Scotland, Scandinavia, and that icy corner of your great-aunt's ancestral cottage, bed curtains were essential tools in the nightly battle against frosty draughts, which could be as lethal as a vengeful goose. The idea was simple. When you can't heat the room, make the room smaller, much smaller. A bed curtain could trap the fugitive warmth of your own body, as well as the subtle but noble heat of a warming pan slid under the sheets earlier in the evening. More on that eccentric metal relic later. And so, people effectively slept inside a drapery cocoon, a boudoir burrow, a fabric fortress meant not just for modesty, but mortal survival. This mini microclimate, though charming to the modern sensibility, had its drawbacks. The air inside could become committed, uncirculated, the sort of air best described as historical. Yet, this was preferable to waking up with frost detailing your mustache or your chamber pot looking like a snow globe. Now, not every household could manage a four-poster bed with enough drapery to reclothe the cathedral. The less affluent made do with wool blankets strung up modestly over rope, creating makeshift tents inside their bedrooms. Imagine, even your dreams had to pass through a flap on the way in. Speaking of dreams, few speak more eloquently to warmth through community than the age-old practice of, well, sleeping with people. No, not like that. I mean in quantity. Entire families would often sleep in the same bed. Mum, dad, children, the odd cousin, and sometimes a very mellow goat. This wasn't a quaint Christmas card scene. It was thermal logic. Multiple humans generate multiple degrees of heat. The science now has a name: thermoregulation. Back then, the word was simply closer. In many parts of the world, This group snoozing wasn't merely tolerated, it was strategically essential. The Inuit, for instance, developed the kazgik, a communal men's house partially underground, where warmth was preserved by densely packing bodies into ingeniously insulated quarters. These gathering places served as spaces for warmth, storytelling, and snores that reportedly startled seals. Similarly, in feudal Japan, where solid, fuel-efficient stoves were as rare as polite kangaroos, families would cluster around hibachi or kotatsu tables. These were low wooden tables with a heat source underneath and thick quilts draped over them. People would sit with their legs underneath, often falling asleep with their upper bodies sprawled out, heads nestled like sleepy house cats. When the warmth comes, from beneath, the dreams do too. And then there were the wooden sleeping closets of the Netherlands and Belgium, cozy little wooden cubicles built directly into the wall. The boxed bed, or bedstead, was essentially a cabinet for people. They had doors you could shut, sometimes even windows you could open onto the room, the reasoning being apparently that opening a window within a windowless box felt somehow liberating. Cozy as they were, it's hard not to imagine that sleeping in one was like occupying a particularly polite coffin. But warm is warm, and that's what mattered. Also, your snoring stayed inside, like a domestic reverb chamber. Of course, not everything humans did to sleep warmer was so carefully crafted. Sometimes, they just wore all their clothes to bed, all of them, including hats. Nightcaps weren't just whimsical choices for Dickensian characters. They were critical gear in the battle against bedroom breezes. A warm head prevented warmth escaping through the scalp and saved people the indignity of shivering themselves awake with stylish hair. Even now, on chilly eves, one may feel the ancestral tug of bundling under increasingly absurd layers. A second blanket, a sweater, a scarf, and perhaps a cat, strategically deployed. All these things connect us to our forebears who, lacking electricity, central heat, or the marvel that is fleece-lined pajama bottoms, resorted to anything, everything, and occasionally everyone to stay warm. And yet, despite all these meticulous efforts to build warmth from scraps and cleverness, sometimes the only choice left was to bring the heat with you. But that is a spicy tale in itself. As fog curled over the cobbled streets like a cloak left behind by a sleepy magician, one of humanity's oldest wintertime dreams flickered in the hearths and hearts of Northern Europe, the home sauna. Yes, in Scandinavia, long before electricians discovered how to charge you for central heating, people were heating stones and throwing water on them for therapeutic purposes, and also for fun. The Finnish sauna, particularly, was much more than a sweat lodge with commitment issues. It was the warm, beating heart of Finnish life, where babies were sometimes born, the dead prepared for burial, and everyone in between got gloriously sweaty. Take that electric blankets. Imagine a little wooden cabin, its walls blackened from centuries of smoke and stories. Fire-heated stones piled like ancient eggs of a dragon who only breathed steam. Inside villagers sat shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in silence or soft laughter, occasionally slapping themselves with birch branches. Not out of madness, but tradition. The birch, or vita, released a fresh, leafy aroma that was widely appreciated. If you're wondering when this practice started, historians estimate around 2000 BC, give or take a goose feather. It wasn't just Finland. Across medieval Russia, the banya served the same function. They took their steam with more of a spirited slap, sometimes accompanied by vodka or superstitions. One would clamber in, thaw their frostbitten soul, and perhaps smear themselves in honey for exfoliation, because nothing says cozy winter night quite like fermenting in your own sweet marinade. But warmth wasn't always so romantic. In other corners of medieval Europe, getting through the winter borrowed less from spa culture and more from the huddle and the hope method. And so, let us turn now to another peculiar European strategy, riveting in its lack of safety, the humble bed warmer. A bed warmer was essentially a frying pan with self-esteem, a long-handled metal pan filled with hot coals, which was slid under the bed covers before bedtime. Beds were like iceboxes during the winters, the kind of cold that made your teeth consider hibernation. Sliding in a coal-filled pan seemed logical at the time, and only occasionally tragic if someone forgot to remove it. Yes, occasionally, this tool of warming comfort turned mattresses into marshmallows. This practice was actually considered safer than the earlier strategy, heated bricks. Masons and maids all across the chilly world would toss a cleaned-up brick into the fire for a spell, wrap it in flannel, and slip it into bed. An early prototype of the modern hot water bottle, though considerably harder if kicked. Keeping a house warm, meanwhile, required steady attention and skill. Fireplaces were often the central feature of a room, not just aesthetically, but practically. Logs were chosen, chopped, and stacked with precision rivaling chess strategy. In colonial America, a well-tended fire was practically currency. Ashes were even saved for lye, used in soap making and bread. Entire family schedules revolved around coaxing the fire to live through the night. Failure meant waking up with your breath visible and soul temporarily relocated to your toes. But let us not forget one of the rare joys of pre-electric winter life. The warming pan became obsolete thanks to the invention of the foot warmer, a personal, portable tin or wooden box filled with live embers, carried in carriages or under church pews. Worshipping the divine was made easier when your toes weren't threatening mutiny. It made sermons less about eternal fire and more about immediate comfort. Foot warmers even inspired a fate for the phrase, to warm the bench. Turns out, languishing on the sidelines may have been warmer than playing on the medieval football field. And so, from communal sweat lodges and birch-scented breezes to the glowing embers beneath a velvet blanket, history has shown time and again, if there was a way to heat ourselves, we would find it. If necessary, we'd invent one using bricks, tin, saunas, coal, or, eventually, snuggies. Now picture the hearth again, the fire sighing against thick logs, its breath slow and red. There's a shadow moving toward it, the shape of a person cradling a warm mug of something spiced and ancient. Outside, the snow falls like the quiet punctuation of the night, silent and soft and slowly settling. And while some warmed with coals or steam, others took a different approach entirely, by simply never going outside. Let's drift to that thought. A winter lifestyle of chic refusal, of choosing to hibernate indoors like the elegant loaf you are. In the chillier corners of history, where frost gathers in the tiniest cracks of windows and breath fogs up even the boldest candlelight, humans got a little creative. One such masterpiece of practical ingenuity, the bed as a heating device, not the modern bed, fluffed with synthetic pillows and temperature-regulating duvets. No. We're talking about the grand old wooden structure, sometimes creaky, often drafty, frequently shared with a spouse, 2 children, an elderly relative, and on special occasions, a chicken or 2, all comfortably jammed under a heavy woolen mass that doubled as a weight training device. Beds in the Middle Ages were less cozy retreat and more group survival pod. Instead of warming the room, people simply warmed each other. The family that sleeps together creeps together. Toward body heat, that is. But one should not ignore the VIP of ancient sleep technology, the humble bed warmer. A brass or copper pan on a long handle, filled with hot coals and slid between the icy sheets. Essentially, it was a medieval curling iron for your mattress. Of course, it wasn't without risk. Too long in one place, and your mattress could go from lukewarm luxury to lightly flambéed. Still, people took their chances. A warm bed was worth the gamble, especially in winters when eyelids could frost shut. And then there were foot warmers, compact wooden boxes filled with embers, carried into churches and carriages like small, smouldering pets. Picture a 17th century lady shivering in her pew, discreetly toasting her toes while listening to a sermon that drifted on longer than an alpine winter. Smoke sometimes drifted up from beneath the skirts of pious women. If you smelled burning petticoat, it was probably just someone getting a little too cozy. The Dutch, whom we must always thank for elevating coziness to an art form, used foot stoves routinely. These warm little boxes were often placed inside larger enclosed beds called bedstees, which were essentially sleeping cupboards built into the wall. Being tucked away in a sleeping nook like a wearable drawer had its trade-offs. Warm and secure, sure, but God help you if someone stole the ladder. Let us not breeze past the Korean ondol system, which truly deserves a round of toasty applause. Invented long before electricity even dreamed of existing, the ondol used flues running beneath the floor, channeling hot smoke from the kitchen hearth through stone passages under one's living quarters. The result? Radiant floor heating, centuries before underfloor heating. Pads became an item on upscale renovation shows. Just imagine waking up on a stone floor that's somehow warmer than your blanket. Korea. Teaching everyone that the floor could be a luxury destination. Japan, meanwhile, introduced us to one of the coziest inventions to ever grace existence, the kotatsu. A low wooden table draped with a thick futon and heated underneath by a small brazier, or, in modern versions, an electric heater. Families would gather around the kotatsu, slide their legs beneath the heavy blanket, and pretty much live there all winter. Meals, games, naps, mild existential crises, all conducted in kotatsu warmth. In theory, it's a table. In practice, it's a lifestyle. Now let's voyage westward to Victorian England, where domestic habits were soaked in etiquette, frilled in lace, and chilled to the bone. Drawing rooms were often vast enough to confuse small pets, yet only a single stubborn fireplace worked to heat the entire expanse. A visit to one's distant aunt could feel oddly glacial unless one had the fashionable accessory of the time, a warming brick wrapped in flannel, smuggled under one's skirts like a secret society pledge. And of course, the dressing gown, that shapeless yet undeniably dignified fashion staple of the 19th century lounge lizard. Fashioned from velvet or quilted cotton, it was the wearable hearth. Pair it with a pipe, slippers, and a pointed disdain for drafts, and you had yourself a personal solution to architectural incompetence. It's worth pausing a moment to observe just how profoundly human warmth has depended not solely on fire or invention, but on closeness, the shared effort of togetherness in the cold. Whether bundled under shared quilts, huddled around a single fire, or legs tangled beneath a kotatsu, people have always found warmth in each other, just as often as in the hearth. And so, the world cooled and warmed, era by era, creating new characters in the drama of staying warm. Some were inventions, some were traditions, and some, well, occasionally they had feathered beaks and shared the foot of your bed. Tomorrow night, we will step from the bedroom to the battlefield, as bizarre as that sounds, and discover how armies used warmth not just to survive, but occasionally to outwit their frozen foes. In the thick of winter, when frost nibbled at noses and windows wore lace made of ice, people of the past turned to a surprising ally in the battle against the cold: communal warmth. You see, before central heating and electric blankets turned the world into a push-button sauna, staying warm was something of a group effort, a human-powered heat source, if you will. Let's begin in the medieval banquet hall. No, not the one with turkey legs and theatrical swordplay, but a real one. Massive stone walls that could hold out a siege, or at least a decent November draft, and a fire that roared in a hearth as wide as a family sedan. The fire, though grand and smoky, had the thermal efficiency of a sneeze in a snowstorm. So people clustered together: nobles, servants, visiting lords, and that one minstrel who always played the lute a bit too confidently. Everyone huddled near the hearth like cats around a radiator, sipping warm ale, or, if they were lucky, a stew flavoured heavily with salt, onions, and hopeful guesses. But the real secret wasn't the fire. It was proximity, body heat, the timeless and slightly clammy magic of being close to another warm-blooded creature. Monasteries knew this well. Monks, those champions of frugality and extremely early mornings, often slept huddled in dormitories without separate rooms. Austerity, yes, but also a rather convenient way to conserve warmth. Cloisters may have limited worldly pleasures, but they never said no to a warm monk on a cold night. In more domestic settings, the bed became a battlefield against the elements. Not only a place of rest, but the headquarters of warmth strategies. Enter the bedmate. It wasn't always romantic. Sometimes it was intentional, and other times it was just what had to be done. Entire families slept together, from eldest grandma to squirmy toddlers, zigzagged sideways across the mattress like a pack of human sardines. Privacy was scarce, but let's be honest, so was hypothermia. And if your budget allowed for a bit of flair, it wasn't the four-poster bed that made you fancy. It was the bed curtains. Think of them as the medieval version of a personal insulation pod. Heavy drapes that surrounded the bed, keeping in every breath of warm air you exhaled, and denying passage to the icy drafts determined to sneak through ancient window panes and ill-fitting doors. Some curtains were so thick they could muffle a conversation, or at least part of a poorly sung ballad from the tavern down the lane. Then there were the feather beds, stuffed with goose down if you were fancy, or chickens, pigeons, or anything reasonably fluffy if you were resourceful. The warmth trapped inside was nearly mythical. Lying in one was considered a luxury. Getting out of one in the morning, however, was an act of spiritual courage. Of course, let's not overlook the power of pets. Not just companions, but strategic thermal devices. Dogs, especially the small lazy ones, were literal foot warmers. Cats were radiators with whiskers. And if you were truly at the edges of luxury, you might have owned a lapdog breed like the King Charles Spaniel, a pooch bred not just for royal laps but medieval toes. But the star of our chapter tonight might well be the warming pan, a shallow metal pan with a lid filled with glowing coals and placed in the bed moments before sleep. This was not a job for the careless. One wrong move with your coal shovel, and you might have a cozy fire going somewhere unfortunate, like the mattress. Maids would run them between the sheets quickly to avoid scorching the linens, then retreat, leaving behind the faint smell of singed cotton and sweet relief. Bed was never more inviting than when it had been preheated like an oven-ready pie. Even socializing was more about the heat than the chit-chat. Taverns weren't just spots for ale and awkward lute solos. They were warm hubs where townsfolk gathered, snug in wooden nooks, feet toasting on the flagstones beside a robust hearth. The fire was equal parts entertainment and necessity, with cracked mugs and gossip flowing in equal measure. In those days, no warm spot went to waste. And beyond all the clever gadgets, furry friends, and human heat exchanges, there was also a philosophy of slowness, an unspoken rhythm that came from being in sync with the seasons. Cold was not to be conquered in an instant, but gently kept at bay. Warmth was earned, huddled toward, shared, and cherished. Now, as embers dim and blankets rise, let's drift onward, not away from winter, but deeper into its soft, glowing corners. There's still much to uncover about how warmth wove itself into everyday life, especially when we turn to the little things hiding in plain sight. Long before thermostats clicked on with a comforting hum and electric blankets whispered their silent warmth across our toes, there lived a strange sort of hero, humble, quiet, and slightly crunchy. Enter stage left, straw. Yes, dear listener, straw. Common, golden, rustly straw. If history were an award ceremony, straw would be the supporting actor that appears in nearly every scene, but never gets the applause. But tonight, by lamplight and moonfall, it gets the spotlight. In chillier centuries past, before the cozy arrival of central heating, families across Europe and beyond would rely on the strategic stuffing of straw to keep warm. It wasn't just for donkeys and roofs. Straw found its way into mattresses, simple ticking sacks filled with golden fluff, transformed each night into not-so-luxurious thrones of itchiness and insulation. It was nature's unsustainable solution to goose feathers, and aspirational peasantry at its finest. These humble straw beds were affectionately known in some countries as palliaces, a word that sounds like it should belong in a romance novel, but truly just means a bag of straw you splay across the floor and hope for the best. The wealthier might top it with a feather bed, if they had one, and sleep like the kind of person who did not routinely wrestle rodents for pillow real estate. Straw was also used more inventively in the 17th and 18th centuries, when clever folks began sewing it into something resembling wearable insulation. Enter the straw-stuffed bodice. External fashion? Perhaps not. But if you're trying to survive a Baltic winter with only wool and questionable soup, the line between fashion-forward and fire hazard grows faint. In medieval Japan, peasants and samurai alike braved winter with waraji and mino, straw sandals and straw cloaks, respectively. Picture someone trying to look intimidating on a freezing battlefield while wearing what looks like a ghillie suit woven by your great-aunt's scarecrow. But it worked, sort of. Straw kept out wind and some moisture, was cheap to replace, and naturally biodegradable, assuming you blocked out the smell. Now, as quaint, nay scratchy, as all this may sound, straw had its limits. Enter the foot warmer, a device designed to make you feel pampered, provided you ignored the logistical hazards. Usually fashioned from metal or wood, a foot warmer was essentially a portable box filled with glowing coals, slid discreetly under your skirts or set at your feet in sleigh rides and prayer pews alike. Churches, after all, were notoriously cold. Theological fervor does little to warm toes. Pious souls would come in with their portable braziers. Yes, people brought their own heating devices to the sermon. And perhaps That's why services took so long. Nobody wanted to leave their little ember haven. Meanwhile, in Dutch households, forever featured in cozy, vaguely melancholic paintings, tile stoves and foot warmers were practically characters themselves. The Dutch had a clever trick. They would warm clay or soapstone bricks in the fire, wrap them in flannel or wool, and tuck them into beds. The result? A sleep companion that was warm, silent, and did not steal the covers. Of course, travel in winter raised new challenges. Consider the horse-drawn sleigh, already a chilly mode of transport. Passengers would layer thick woolen cloaks and perhaps wrap themselves in a bearskin robe, which always sounds more elegant than pragmatic, until you realize the robe sometimes still had the bear's expression. But the crown jewel of personal warmth may be the humble bed warmer. That long-handled, lidded pan filled with embers slid under the sheets to toast the bedding before nestling in. A noble concept, except many a sleepless soul in the 18th century discovered, too late, that if you leave a pan of burning coals under your covers for too long, you wake not to warmth, but to smouldering linens, mild smoke inhalation, and one very stern lecture from your innkeeper or spouse. And yet somehow, humanity survived. Through hay, hearths, and heated bricks, our ancestors wove their winters out of whatever warmth they could beg, borrow, or build. Today, we luxuriate under the trillion-thread count quilt of innovation, while they once dreamt beside warm rocks and the flicker of a fire barely tamed. Somewhere in the hush of those old nights, nestled beside a straw bed and an ember tin, lies the quiet ingenuity of staying warm, without a plug. And speaking of fire, let's drift next into the golden age of hot beverages, steaming, spiced, and sometimes medicinal. For what's cozier than warmth you can sip? Outside, icicles clung like frosted fangs to the eaves of a Tudor cottage. Inside, however, the hearth crackled with orange light, and a sleepy cat was slowly baking itself to perfection on a warm stone floor. It was a scene so comforting, you could almost hear a medieval lute softly strumming somewhere off to the left. But that cozy image took considerable effort, and often a borderline suspicious level of ingenuity. You see, in the absence of thermostats or central heating, which hadn't yet wafted into history like a warm sigh, humans had to get rather creative in their pursuit of not freezing. We've already encountered various drafts of the humble bed warmer, those long-handled metal pans filled with glowing embers and wielded like toasty sabers against the cold. But in some households, particularly where one couldn't afford an entire bedpan arsenal, warmth was a community effort, or more accurately, a livestock effort. Let's turn, with appropriately gentle reverence, to the medieval phenomenon of the byre dwelling. In certain rural areas, notably in the chillier corners of Northern Europe, it wasn't uncommon for the family to share a roof with their animals. Not in a chaotic, full petting zoo way, but sensibly partitioned, humans on one side, cows and goats on the other. The logic? Animals gave off heat. Quite a lot of it, in fact. The average cow churns out roughly the same warmth as a small space heater, minus the hum, and with significantly more mooing. Thus, you'd often have a frostbitten farmer and his family drifting off to sleep in a one-room cottage warmed not just by a peat fire, but by Bessie the cow's slow ambient exhalations. Cozy, in a barnyard sort of way. And those who didn't cohabitate with cows simply layered up like sentient onions. The Elizabethans, for instance, adored many things: drama, collars that scraped the ceiling, and undergarments so extensive they could double as armor. It was not uncommon to be dressed in up to 5 separate layers of wool and linen. Before bed, one might change into a less restrictive nightshirt, but always under the watchful eye of the prevailing draft. Bedrooms, especially in larger houses, weren't necessarily warmer than a jail cell, just more elegantly furnished. This is where things took a deliciously bizarre turn. Some folks opted for sleeping in clothes warm from the fire. Thanks to a process that sounds wildly irresponsible today, they'd toast their garments over the hearth and then put them on just before bed, attempting to split-second their way into sleep before the chill caught up. Yes, attempting to win a race against coldness, armed only with warm trousers and raw optimism. Occasionally, this led to comically scorched nightgowns or heated discussions over who left their breeches smouldering. But for many, it was worth it. In regions like Scandinavia, where winter carried a certain dramatic flair, people leaned especially hard into the benefits of a strong communal sauna culture. Before retiring to bed, entire families might spend time bathing and sweating in pine-scented smokehouses of steamy bliss. Far from just a social ritual, the residual warmth soaked into the skin and linen nightwear alike, making the transition to a cold bed marginally more bearable. Parents tucked children in, while still emanating the gentle steam of boiled birch twigs and familial bonding. In feudal Japan, the kotatsu emerged as perhaps one of the coziest inventions in the international campaign against freezing. This was a low wooden table covered by a thick, heavy blanket, under which a heat source was placed. Originally charcoal, later electricity. Families would gather to eat, talk, nap, and sometimes conduct several hours of social inertia beneath it. Slipping your legs under the kotatsu felt, I imagine, like quietly entering a domestic hot tub filled with laughter and rice crackers. And then there were the warming traditions of Russia, where the glorious pechka, a large masonry stove, served not just for cooking and heating, but for sleeping too. These brick stoves were such an integral part of the home that people sometimes built sleeping niches directly into or atop them. Grandmother might curl up on the warm brick roof of the pechka like a dignified bread-making lizard, gently radiating contentment. No two places solved the warmth puzzle in the same way, but all were inventive, and most involved more than a bit of community, fabric and fire, which really is how most problems worth solving are approached. And now, as the last ember of the imagined hearth flickers down to a soft crimson glow, we drift one step closer to the finest layer of warmth history has to offer. One not worn on the body, but wrapped around it, handcrafted with care, and often filled with feathers. As the firelight of our journey flickers low and shadows stretch across the cozy timeline of old ways and wool socks, we come to one last ember of warmth, one final sleepy puff of historical whimsy to see us off. So fluff your pillow like a Flemish feather merchant, tuck in like a 14th century peasant before the frost, and let us meander slowly and dreamily toward how warmth and humanity wrapped one another up in the quieter corners of the past. Not all warmth was logs and labor. Sometimes it came in the form of humble togetherness, like the German tradition of Stube, literally translating to heated room, where families gathered not just for warmth, but for everything. Eating, spinning yarn, argumentatively debating who took the goat's blanket. The stube was the emotional hearth of the home, a little wooden pocket of sweaty grandparents, clashing soup flavors and questionable foot smells, and yet so cozy. Meanwhile, in Edo period Japan, People stayed warm using a glowing little wonder called a kotatsu. Picture a low wooden table with a heat source underneath and a big fluffy futon draped over it. Now, place yourself under that table, legs tucked in, warm from the knees down, sipping tea and pretending to be productive while slowly becoming one with the furniture. Entire winter days melted away under kotatsu blankets as families huddled around a shared space of soft warmth and slow snacks. Some say people even studied and worked beneath them. Others think people mostly napped and occasionally yelled across the room for more mochi. Frankly, history supports both. And speaking of more, let's not forget that warmth wasn't always honest. Sometimes it was cleverly impersonated. The ancient Romans, for example, invented not just heated tile floors, but something for the commoner's cold too, the cleverly named Pannonian cloak, which is to say, an enormous, glorified wool blanket you wore like a toga, had a passionate, unregulated romance with a bath mat. Dignified, not exactly. Warm, emphatically yes. In medieval monasteries, where vows of silence mingled with vows of please no more frostbite, monks got creative. They stuffed straw into mattress sacks and sometimes even their own cloaks, which gave them the look of overstuffed scarecrows at a winter film festival. Nights were long, prayers were longer, and if you slept near the scriptorium chimney, consider yourself blessed by both God and radiant masonry. There were also less exuberant pastimes. In 17th century Dutch paintings, you'll often see people engaging in something known as bed sharing, where multiple family members or even travelers would sleep in the same bed. Not always out of familial love, but basic thermodynamic necessity. The family that spooned together seldom froze together. Of course, the paintings don't show too much mention of the morning breath or the endless arguments over who hogged the covers. But perhaps that's a blessing reserved for the viewer's imagination. And then finally, there were the simplest warmings of all, the long bedtime stories, whispered fireside tales of lands far away, or just the same local legend told for the 50th time with only slightly fewer embellishments. Their heat came not from kindling or coals, but from the gentle settling in of a shared narrative, the safe thrum of predictable plot lines and familiar endings. Perhaps, humans discovered, warmth didn't just come from keeping the cold out, but from keeping each other in. So many methods, so many mittens, and through each frostbitten century, we curled tighter under quilts, huddled closer to dogs, and clasped mugs like sacred relics of the hearth. We built houses of stone and straw, dug beds into earthen floors, and made friends with flaming pans full of charcoal. Even if, at times, those pans turned out to be slightly more aggressive roommates than expected. But always, we reached toward warmth, in wool, in companionship, in clever little devices with glowing hearts below tables, and here, with one last rustle of the blankets and a long, settling sigh, we curl into the present. No frost creeping under the door tonight, only the quiet hum of now, of warm beds, drifting, thoughts, and the soft, steady pulse of a story well told. Now rest, dear listener. The fire's gone faint, the chimney sighs, and history, that old sleepy cat, curls up at the foot of your bed. Let yourself drift into the muffled hush of dreams, where the only thing colder than frost is the teacup left beside your pillow, cooling gently, quietly, as the night carries you home.